Right, welcome to topic 1, theoretical perspectives in science teaching. And this is a little bit of an overview of the course, week 1, and also of the Moodle website so that we can actually get ourselves active and functioning in the program. So let's go and have a look at what we're talking about this week. We begin with pedagogical frameworks in science, and we'll focus a lot this semester on student representations in science. Because student representations really are what we're feeding on in inquiry-based learning. What we're actually sitting down with, we are starting to deconstruct the learner's view of science and the world as they see it scientifically. We then start to slowly work towards reconstruction. We help them construct their own view of the world, and then we help them reconstruct and reinterpret and reapply that in context of their own experiences and their own worldviews. So this is primarily why we're focusing on this concept of representation, and why representation is central to a lot of the inquiry-based frameworks we're looking at. When we look at this particular unit overview, I've asked you to do a couple of things this week. And we begin by saying, for instance, science education, and here we're focusing on the physical and chemical sciences. So it's two of the strands of the ACS. It's not the entire ACS, but we're focusing on the two of them. And we're really looking to establish science education as a critical mechanism for developing members of society who can make evidence-based decisions about local, national and global issues. And as a result, this unit explores some of the theoretical frameworks that underpin the new ACS, and you know, going back to Piaget in 1962, this mechanism that enables students to become scientists in their own lives. So in this mode and in this spirit, we're actually going to commit ourselves to looking at science as scientists. And so I begin to ask you to register with the Science by Doing website. Now this is free. The information has been sent to you in emails and also on notices. So please enroll in that, and it'll become apparent to you fairly quickly as to why I'm asking you to do this. There's some really great activities that we're going to refer to throughout the semester in the Science by Doing website. It also travels with you. They're free resources, and they're relevant to both Assessment Task 1 and Assessment Task 2. So you can actually start becoming very familiar with those science programs now that you can use in both of those assessment tasks. By week 3, I'm also going to ask you to download the Chemical Maze app from iTunes or Google Apps when we start to look at chemical sciences. And for those of you who don't feel competent teaching chemistry, you really enjoy this one because it brings chemistry into the real world of the students. And here we've got a picture down on the right hand side of the Chemical Maze. It's described as a shopping companion, but believe me, it's much, much more than that, as we'll look when we start to investigate. In enrolling on the Science by Doing website, here's an example of how to do it.
Let's log in to the Science by Doing website. If you're not a registered user, you'll have to go to the registration page. Enter your name and school. Tell us what kind of user you are. Provide your email address and a password. Agree to the terms of use. And finally, prove that you aren't a robot. If your email address ends in edu.au or several other educational domains, you will receive a confirmation email immediately. If you have a different address, it will take a little longer. Here's my confirmation email. Click on the link, back to the home page, and log in.
Right, as you can see, it's a very simple process, and I think you'll find those resources absolute gold by the time the semester's over. The MOODLE site, here's a little guide to the MOODLE site as well. Welcome to the MOODLE site. As you can see, this is the 2017 iteration of Chemical and Physical Sciences, and I'm sure once we get the MOODLE bedded down, everything will be running quite fine. As we can see, it's a fairly standard layout, and a couple of things I want to point out. First of all is I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders past, present and future community leaders from the original inhabitants and custodians of this land, and where we work and where we study and where we share. So thank you for that. The learning management approach I would like to list, for instance, is on the front page under that first heading. It's very brief, basically stipulating that I will have 2 lectures per week that I will post. The first will be a content lecture, and that will deal with the content information each week. The second is going to be a collaborative Zoom session. And this is based on the model espoused by Betty Collis from 2001 to 2005. Betty hailed from the Netherlands and dealt with adult and professional learning. So in her model, we work from basically a website where we deconstruct our current understanding of what chemical and physical science is, particularly as teachers. We then reconstruct some new frameworks around teaching chemical and physical sciences, and then, ultimately, we co-construct a science pedagogy to deliver this to our learners. And that's done in a collaborative way, so the aim of the Zoom session is for you to move through those 3 steps. And you can only do that by participation. So please, if you can't make the session, here it is, Wednesdays from 10 to 11. If you can't make the session, please view the video, and in order to get involved in the video, email any questions or post your questions to the forum. Now, I'd like to direct you over here to the sign information. Okay, and we can see here, for instance, I've posted a couple of different forums. The first one is the Q&A forum, and the Q&A forum is there for your daily, weekly exchanges and concerns. The news forum is my territory, and that's where I'll post any information relevant to you about changes, problems, issues, things as they arise. The weekly content material can be found here in the weekly content lecture links. And what happens is, when that page actually opens, I've actually put a little indication here of the model I'm using. I've borrowed it from Russell Stannard. It's the flipped classroom model. So each week on Monday or Tuesday I will post a content lecture, and on Wednesday we'll review that lecture as we go back and we look at the Zoom information, the Zoom issues that are raised for that in our collaborative exchanges. Going back to the course page, you will find here another forum where the weekly Zoom sessions will be posted. Now, these will be posted as hyperlinks for week 1, week 2, week 3, so you'll be able to go back to them and review them at any given point in time. The model I'm using here, of course, is Betty Collis's contributing student model. And you can see it works from an information repository, our MOODLE site. We go through assessment, we go through exchange, we go through a whole lot of dialogue, and we emerge into our communities of practice as teachers, science, where we're implementing this information. So that's the rationale behind the site. That is the rationale behind the approaches taken with the forums, designed not to bother you too much and to enable you to focus pretty clearly on your teaching and learning aspects. Now, at the moment, for instance, you'll see there is assessment task number 1, which is spelt out for you here on the assessment task descriptions and examples. I've also listed some famous or infamous misconceptions in the science field. This first one here is a web-based list, and this second one here is a downloadable Word document. Now, you may find your own for assessment task number 1. Please do not be confined to the ones that we've provided for you here. The 3 examples there are from past student work. I won't tell you the grades they received because we're not putting up exemplars, we're just putting up examples. We don't want to limit what you can do. Assessment task number 2, you'll also find the information here as well, and you can see there are samples put there, as well as the primary connections units of work for you to review. You're not restricted to primary connections. You can use some of the science by doing materials that we're presenting and promoting to you throughout the term. So there are 2 assessment tasks. The information you will find for them there, and the descriptions of the tasks you will find over here in our assessment bar. As you can see here, for instance, assessment 1, misconceptions. We go on there, and it takes us basically to 2 hyperlinks here, the marking criteria and a description of the task. Going to the description of the task, you can see it is a downloadable PDF document. So you can actually save it and refer to it at any given time and not need to employ it and access it independently many times. Going back to the course content, you will find the material laid out for you week by week, moment by moment, and hopefully task by task. This is the format I follow in each week. Each week has a clear topic, and in that topic we go through and we have learning activities and materials. There's usually a video. Linda Pfeiffer has put together some nice avatars, and there's some links to assessment, which gives you a little bit of a description of what your tutors and some of the approaches your tutors may take to the material for the week. that's the format we're going to follow. It will be predictable. It's going to follow that flow week to week, and hopefully as a result you'll always know where you are, what you're doing, and what should come next. Welcome to the subject. Right, looking at the learning outcomes for our week 1 topic, theoretical frameworks. So you're supposed to be able to, at the end of this week, list the places where students may connect to science in their worlds, and that can be anywhere. Describe ways in which students' scientific understanding can be effectively enhanced in the classroom. Here we bring in the teaching models, and then explain some of the different pedagogical approaches in science that we can take. And here, because of the ACS, we talk about some of the different pedagogical approaches, all in the inquiry model. Now that's primarily underpins the ACS. There is no point going beyond that, because that's the model that we are employing in our curriculum frameworks. The key terms: science is a body of knowledge. Quite straightforward, it's set out for you there. Created from activities and the thinking of people over time. It changes over time, and hence, Popper and his falsification principles. Contextualising, science can take on a different concept and a different place depending on the context in which it's presented. The pedagogical frameworks, ways of teaching. There's the 5 E's approach, there's POE, there's problem-based learning, there's a whole range of different ways of presenting science as an investigative framework. And finally, this notion central to week 1 and to assessment task 1 of misconceptions, and that when what is learned has only been partially understood or completely misunderstood, and we can blame a lot of factors on that misunderstanding. We can blame errors in fact, we can blame type 1, type 2 errors in scientific research, or we can blame science fiction and C-3PO for some of the comments he's made in some of our more popular television shows. So when we start to look at brainstorming where science is, we can name many sites at which we can point to as scientific repositories. David Attenborough, we all love. Comics, movies, books, everyday life, family. Family often provide their own explanations. Now, in the website each week, we have these activities that you're required to complete each week, and they are useful activities. The reason why we get to complete those activities is because they're actually a scaffold for the assessment items. And so we begin by looking at the cross-curricular links in science. Now we can see, for instance, they're listed for us there. Science is not the centre of the world. It is for the purposes of this topic, but we know that it interacts with English, it interacts with human society, history, technology design and mathematics. And as a matter of fact, if we go back and review the Australian curriculum and we look at the 7 general capabilities, we can see in fact that numeracy, literacy, ICT, cultural competence, all of these different aspects are part of the scientific framework. So much so that the Australian curriculum for science has 3 priorities, and one of those priorities of course is Indigenous culture. Another one is Asian perspectives too, all on science and curricular and development and history and industry and ideology. So we can see that our science curriculum is influenced by a wide range of generic, cultural, social and socio-cultural capabilities. We're going to focus on inquiry-based learning and how we contextualise science using inquiry-based learning. Now, I'll just leave you to read and browse through the text here as I'm reading. I'm going to introduce you to the Science by Doing Inquiry Guide throughout the term as we go. Now, inquiry-based teaching is much more than giving students opportunities just to inquire. Okay? It involves a lot of micro skills to actually deliver an inquiry-based lesson, and posing questions, planning, conducting, critiquing investigations, collecting, analysing, we're starting to read a little bit like Bloom. And so it's going to be no surprise one of the next slides that pops up is Bloom. It makes perfect sense. You know enough about your learning at this stage to predict that. Students are involved in inquiry learning when they develop understanding of a science topic through seeking answers to questions. So they're not actually learning facts, they're seeking answers to situated questions. Our third paragraph up here, when undertaking an inquiry-based learning unit, the teacher will use a range of pedagogical strategies, and throughout the course we're going to look at some of these. Concept mapping, and we can look at concept mapping software, what's effective. Brainstorming, envoys, putting people in groups and getting a representative from each group to do a summary. A gallery walk, where we can actually have a more physical, kinesthetic experience. Jigsaws, where we break people up and work across multiple groups. And of course POE, the 8-step model, which is really an elaboration on the 5 E's model that Bribey and write about, and which has been popularised in the Science by Doing and also in the ACS frameworks. So the label inquiry-based can be applied to a single activity, to a sequence within a unit, or to a whole curriculum unit. And students are doing inquiry when they are constructing their understanding through participation. And we can see here in Table 1, there are many forms that inquiry can take. The teacher can direct inquiry. I'm going to see some examples shortly where the teacher can lead it. Okay, it can be a closed version at this end of the scale, or an open version where the teacher can go through each of these different type of inquiry steps. So in a closed model, the teacher, for instance, is doing a lot of the leading. In guided inquiry, the teacher is doing a lot of the leading. In guided inquiry, we can see here the teacher is doing a lot of the leading, and in open inquiry, it's peer-to-peer. We can see the method starts to vary here. Okay, when we start to move from guided inquiry, we can see that it's both a teacher and student mediated model. In conclusion, okay, when we're looking at the teacher, the student, the student, the student, we can see that under different inquiry models, under different inquiry types, depending on whether it's closed or it's open or it's low-level guided or high-level guided, we can see that each of the roles that teachers play and learners play will vary. Now I'm going to introduce these to you as three different kinds of roles. The teacher-led session in a closed session, I'm going to call the sage on the stage. The teacher-student model, I'm going to call the meddler in the middle. And the open-ended inquiry, the teacher sits as the guide on the side. And these are three metaphors that I want you to remember, because these are valuable metaphors in helping you work out how you're going to conduct your science lessons. And in any one lesson, you may start as the sage on the stage. You may break into small group teaching and become the meddler in the middle, and then ultimately sit down with students who are struggling and be the guide on the side. So we are seeing this iteration of form of inquiry, and the responsibilities of teachers and students is going to vary dramatically depending on the nature of the task you're doing. In Activity 2, in the learning activities for this week, we introduce the three-stage framework. No matter what model of inquiry you're using, whether it's POE, the 5 E's, problem-based, you're going to follow three basic stages. And Professor Dennis Goodman from the ACS will talk about these in a minute. But the three stages basically are the exploratory stage, and we've mapped this onto Brybe's 5 E's. Engage, explore are two aspects of the exploratory stage of the framework. The redescribing, where we rethink the idea with evidence, science view, and that becomes the explain stage, the 3rd E. And the application, try out an idea in another context, elaborate and evaluate how well the idea fits. So we can see that it really is a three-stage framework, inquiry-based learning, and the 5 E's can map nicely onto this. POE can map nicely onto this. Problem-based learning can map nicely onto these three stages. Okay, the 5 E's is not to be taken as the only inquiry-based model. It is just one of many. The inquiry-based model, here's an introduction by Professor Dennis Goodman.
The purpose of this DVD is to provide an overview of a simple inquiry lesson. Now, every inquiry lesson is unique, but despite that uniqueness, there are three common parts to an inquiry lesson: the introduction, student activity, and the final concluding part of the lesson. In this lesson, we see some Year 8 students from a government school in Canberra. In the introduction, the purpose that the teacher has is to present the task to the students.
Hi everyone.
Right, now what I'm going to do is play through this in stages and just get you to observe a school teacher in action delivering an inquiry model, because this really is the principle, the content of not only Assessment Task 1 but Assessment Task 2, and it underpins our whole pedagogy for this particular unit.
Well, we're going to do a special lesson today, and I want to look at the rule of the seesaw. Who can tell me something about seesaws? A seesaw has a fulcrum. What's the fulcrum? It's the thing in the middle that makes the seesaw pivot. Okay? So let me draw you a diagram of a seesaw. We have a pivot in the middle there. If you're sitting on a seesaw with someone else, What do you need to do to make the seesaw balance?
Now you'll notice at this stage that it's very teacher-centred. That's okay. This is still inquiry-based learning. Let's look and see how this develops.
To push up off the ground, and you need someone on the other side of the seesaw as well. Well, what happens if this person is bigger?
Then they go down.
One at a time, yep.
They'll go down and they'll go up. They'll go up.
Okay, what if I wanted to balance the seesaw?
Then you put the pivot point in a different place.
We could move the pivot point, but what if it's a seesaw that's stuck in the ground?
Then you put more weight on the other person.
You can put more weight on the other person. Do you generally carry more weight with you when you go to play at the park?
Put another person there.
We could put another person. There's probably one other thing I'm looking
Just
for.
get the other person to push up harder.
Push up harder. I think there is something else that we can do to help balance. What if the bigger person moved closer to the pivot? Would that affect the balance?
Yes.
Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to have a look and see if we can develop a rule that explains how we can balance a seesaw if the weight of the person on each end of that seesaw is different. So technically we're talking about mass today. So I've got some equipment for you. Each of you is going to get a ruler, a pencil, some blue tack and some weights. We're going to make a model of a seesaw, and what I want you to do is try and balance the ruler on the pencil so that it balances. Then what we're going to do is we are going to play around with moving different masses to see whether we can devise a rule that explains how we can balance a seesaw. So you might like to put a mass at the 12 centimetre mark on one side and then balance it with two masses on the other side and see how you need to move the masses to make it balance. Once you've got it balanced, I want you to record on a sheet of paper that I'll give you the positions of the washers and the number of washers that you needed to use. I want you to repeat that a number of times, and you can certainly make up your own experiments here to determine how you do that, or I can give you a couple of suggestions that you need to try. But what I want you to do at the end of this lesson is come back to me with a rule that explains how we can balance a seesaw. Are there any questions about how this is going to operate today? No? I'm now going to invite you to form 5 or 6 groups. I want you to move to the 5 or 6 side benches that I indicated before and wait for me to bring around the equipment. I will also give you each a sheet of paper that you can use to record your findings on if you wish. All right, let's move now.
Right, as you can see, quite explicit teacher instruction. You can see very much emerging here is the I do. Now we're going to the you do, and then finally the we do stage. So we can sort of see the, the explicit instruction coming through this particular model here. Now, just to give you some feedback at this point in time, this teacher has never taught this class before. This is their first interaction. And you can focus on the questioning, on how this teacher is using questions to effectively structure the inquiry. It's guided inquiry, teacher-led guided inquiry. It's still inquiry-based learning. Let's go and see what happens at the next phase.
There is a myth that when students are engaged in an activity, there is no role for the teacher. The opposite is true. This is the time when the teacher interacts with small groups and assists them.
Now this is what I call the meddler in the middle stage. Now the meddler in the middle is the important part in this process, and you'll see the work this teacher does also through instruction, facilitation and inquiry. Oops.
There is a myth that when students are engaged in an activity, there is no role for the teacher. The opposite is true. This is the time when the teacher interacts with small groups and assists them. The teacher also helps the students think more critically about what they are doing.
They put a double, put 200 to weigh.
piece like that, what I suggest you do, stick this on top of the ruler so that your 0 is on the fulcrum.
Okay.
No, you don't have to mark it.
Gotta mark it first, so like this.
Yeah. The 0 has to be on the...
Yeah, so the 0 needs to be like there.
Okay.
And then we just like put the 0 there.
Now you got to do the side.
Now we just go 1 all the way through to 12 on both of the sides.
Okay. Now, this line here is the exact middle of our seesaw. If we put something 1 centimetre this way, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Now you can see the real Vygotskian sort of approach going on there. And you can see the sort of power of what this teacher is achieving as he works through this and helps these students structure their learning. It really is zone of proximal development, trench type teaching.
If we put something 1 centimetre this way, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we put something this way, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why don't we balance 2 washers against 1 washer? What you need to do is change the positions of the 2 washers and the 1 washer until it's balanced, and then record the positions of the 2 sets of washers. Can you make a prediction about what makes the seesaw balance? 1 at 14, 2 at 7. Okay, so that's your first prediction. What if it was 3s? Let's have a go at balancing 3 versus 2. I'll make it easy for you. Move this to the 12 centimetre mark, and then see where you need to move this to make it balance.
If you've 1 at 1, then nah.
Okay, if you have 1 at 1, then you'd have to have...
If you have 4 at 1, and then you have 1 at 4.
If you have, okay, if you have 3 at 3, okay? Yeah. And
then you have
one at 9.
2 times 7 is 14.
Yes.
And then 4 times 3 is 12.
We figured out the measurement times the amount of washers equals the place where you have to put it, but then Rebecca said you don't know how many washers you need, so now we've ended up just confusing ourselves.
I think you've gone one step too far. That first rule, let's test that.
Measurement times the amount of washers.
Yep.
We've tested that.
Okay, and does that work?
Yes.
Good. So I don't think we need to go any further right now.
Timing is always an important factor in any lesson. Ensure you allow sufficient time for cleaning up and student discussion. The discussion provides an opportunity for the students to share their findings and for the teacher to draw these ideas together into a meaningful picture for the students.
I think we may need to put it on the other side. Hold on, let me just see. There we go.
What I want to do now is see if that I can bring everybody's understanding back to a central rule.
Now we'll leave it at this point. We're going to come back and look at the third stage of this particular lesson sequence, the discussion stage. And at this point, the teacher picks the group up and helps facilitate the co-constructed learning. Now have a look at the role that questioning plays here. The teacher is still working to reconstruct learner thinking and then co-construct it towards an environment or to an outcome which is going to help them predict a model or a rule that may cover all seesaws.
Rule that explains how we get the seesaw to balance. Can I start by asking some people to put a hand up and give me an observation that they made during that investigation?
Push it like, put it more like near the centre.
Okay, let's draw a diagram of that. Here's our ruler. Here's our fulcrum. This is the 0 mark. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If I have 2 washers here at the 1, 2, 3 centimetre mark, and if I wanted to balance that with 1 washer, was anyone able to work out where you would need to put it? Yes.
6.
We would need to put 1 at the 6 centimetre mark. Does everyone agree with that? Okay, so 1 washer at the 6 centimetre mark balances 2 washers at the 3 centimetre mark. Okay, so do you want to rethink your statement there?
Okay.
And see if you can tell me.
It's not heavier, it's lighter.
It gets lighter. Good. Would someone else like to expand on what they've heard now and maybe add something new? Yes.
Well, so if you had 2 washers closer to the fulcrum, you'd have to double it going the other way.
Well, what would you have to double?
Like the measurement.
The distance?
Yeah, with 1 washer.
Okay, that's a good comment. To be able to balance 2 washers at a certain point, you would need to have 1 washer at double the distance. So that means then, what is our rule? Who can put that into words? Yep.
The measurement times the amount of washers.
This is part of the rule. To make a seesaw balance, yep.
The measurement times the amount of the washers equals the distance that half the amount of washers has to be.
Well, that might work in one example when you've only got 1 or 2 washers, but I think for us to get our seesaw to balance, the measurement or the distance from the fulcrum, let's change that. The distance from the fulcrum multiplied by the amount of washers on one side of the fulcrum needs to be equal to what?
Needs to be equal to the other side.
It does. So, if we have 2 sides, the distance from the fulcrum multiplied by the amount of washers on one side of the fulcrum needs to be equal to the distance from the fulcrum multiplied by the washers on the other side. So, let me just make sure that our rule holds. If I have, let's say, 3 washers at the 3 centimetre mark, 3 times 3 is 9, good. Where would I need to place my 1 washer on the other side?
At the 9.
At the 9 centimetre mark. What about if I had 4 washers at the 2 centimetre mark? How could I balance it with 2 washers?
Put the 2 washers at the 4.
2 washers at the 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So here we've got 2 times 4. Here we've got 4 times 2. It balances. Well done. So, can everyone say that they understand the rule of the seesaw now? Excellent. Thank you very much. Good work.
Right.
Well, this was an inquiry lesson because I gave them a task to complete. I gave them a question to which they needed to form an answer, and I deliberately held back from telling them how to reach their answer.
We'll stop the teacher there. He goes on to talk about his teaching of the lesson, his relationship with the students. But as you can see, it takes quite a bit of control from a teacher not to jump in and do it for the teachers, for the learner. So you can see inquiry-based learning can often be a pregnant pause. It can often be one of those interesting places where a teacher has to sit and let the learning take place, let the learning evolve. And we can see here it's a facilitation role. And what we can see here as we move through the 5 E's, some of you know this quite well. I mean, in last semester you completed some of this in your assessment and managed to demonstrate these skills quite well. But we'll see what happens through each of these stages. The features of the engage is motivation. The feature of the explore stage is the topic. And the teacher presents and encourages to devise interesting questions to answer, and he did that very, very well. The students, in turn, investigate the question in some way, manipulation of materials, experience, activities. We saw that in evidence. The students use common language during their discussions. Now, that wasn't there beforehand. You know, very early in the piece, the teacher establishes the notion of the fulcrum. Now, it's very good teaching. Okay, he's establishing the common language and the scientific framework. And they go on. Students are encouraged to ask further questions. The explanation phase is about the phenomenon developed. Okay, and here referred to as the rule. Let's devise a rule. And the scientific language, you know, is can you make a prediction at the 8-minute stage of that particular video? This is all science by doing material, and these are the resources I'm going to point you to as the semester goes. The elaborate stage through the exploring the concept in a new situation. Here we can see building concepts and understanding. So we can see this happening right throughout, moving from the specific to the general, and from the general to the predictive rule. And finally, the evaluation, we can see the teacher observing what the students are actually doing and applying these concepts to a real-world framework. And this brings us back to our learning tasks for the week, where we get to examine in our learning tasks what are the characteristics of good teaching, and we can see that the inquiry model actually embeds all of these good characteristics. It's teaching for engagement, learning and understanding. And we can see that it teaches people to identify and prepare resources, including safety awareness. There's the development of the individual, the student's own understandings. And we can ask questions of the self and also the curriculum and also of students. So it is never static. It is a dynamic model. And finally, allows us to evaluate the learning and respond through processes of reflection. Now the teacher goes on, and we will discuss his reflections probably in the Zoom session this week, and elaborate some more of the some of the facts that he revealed. And he actually came up with 4 or 5 recommendations for improvement from that lesson that he would actually implement, which included having the students for a lesson beforehand where he'd explore the science of levers and do a much more teacher-led session, so they went in with the grounded knowledge. In the learning task this week, we ask you to look at your own characteristics. What are your strengths, and how are you going to use each feature if it's not your strength? Where to situate your teaching? We don't all begin as competent sages on the stage. Okay, it can be a nerve-wracking time, and we're much better often, we think, working one-to-one. But in the video, the teacher models all 3 of these facilitation approaches. The sage on the stage is strong in the introduction model. The meddler in the middle is quite prolific and powerful, and I think you'd agree. This is pure Vygotskian teaching here. Trench constructivism, socio-cultural constructivism, the meddler in the middle working the small group. And finally, once the teacher's done that and broken down which groups are moving along and which groups are succeeding and making progress and developing outcomes, he moves to be the guide on the side and starts working peer-to-peer deconstruction and helping them reconstruct their knowledge peer-to-peer, side-by-side, and then returns ultimately to the discussion stage, where he once again becomes the facilitating sage on the stage. So we can see that it's not necessarily a linear process. Even though the 5 E's has often been presented by some of you even in your assessment as a linear process, it can actually be quite cyclical. And here's where the 3 iterations, the 3 facilitation models come in very handy. Engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and you may go back to explore new principles. You may go back and explore new concepts, new applications, and then finally move on to evaluate in general principles. Bloom's taxonomy is the focus of assessment task number 1. Now, not necessarily Bloom's, but the questioning skills derised around Bloom's. Now, the model I've got sitting here is it's the second iteration of Bloom's taxonomy. It's the revised edition, and we can see up here at the create is the key part here. And in this case, the students create a rule. They're combining the parts of their whole inquiry to create a rule to explain the operation of all seesawing mechanisms. They've developed the criteria, the independent evidence to evaluate. They've gone through the processes of analysis. They've applied facts, rule, concepts, ideas. They've actually worked out what they were. They've defined what they were, and they've understood what each of those manipulations were in order to apply them. And finally, they're able to recognise, or primarily recognise and recall facts. The setup of the machine, the setup of the mechanism, the positioning of the items, all of these have led ultimately to the creation of a rule of understanding, and we're seeing science in practice. Some questions here, applications of Bloom's level, and a couple of examples. A remember question. Okay, one of the very first low level. List at least 6 different forces and provide an example of that force. And remember, photograph 6 situations of forces in action, a multimedia response. Right through to applying, produce a PowerPoint report showing the importance of friction. Calculate your weight at 9 different locations within the solar system. Different sorts of examples. And we can see here inquiry-based learning. Evaluate, prepare a newspaper article to outline what implications might be of driving cars that do not have inertia seatbelts. Assess the changes in the shape of racing cars from a force perspective. What force advantage do the changes provide? We can see here that the constructivist approach, the inquiry approach, is really important to not only developing inquiry skills, but to constructing an understanding of the science that students are exploring and employing. It can define as open, closed or guided. There is no one fixed version. It can be all. And when you look at your assessment task 2, for instance, you will come across 2 different units of study, one which may be closed and the other open, and they may be necessarily designed that way. Teachers and students required certain skills to enable effective participation in the forms of inquiry, and the 5 E's is but one model. It's a common model, it's a popular model, and it's a model that's been well adopted and is certainly very useful. Activity 5, again, asks you to look at some questions and how they may be answered. Please give that a go. It's really, really good to try that in terms of your own thinking at this early stage, because activity task 1, assignment task 1, is really all about developing a questioning survey to help address the misconceptions that some students may have in a particular scientific phenomenon. And some of these misconceptions, for instance, cotton comes from sheep, believe it or not. Mass and weight are the same thing. Dinosaurs and cavemen lived at the same time. Mixing paints is the same as colours. When things dissolve, they disappear. Plants get food through their roots. Sounds cannot travel through liquids and solids. These are misconceptions, not so much because they're wrong, because of which the foundation and the evidence upon which they're believed and held. And this, of course, is scientific inquiry that we're trying to encourage. Children's movies and their inaccuracies. I went through a couple of examples of my own. There's no noise in space. Sorry, Trekkies and Star Wars fans. You know, there is no noise in space. It's a silent space. In Armageddon, the space explosions are deafening. Again, another example. C-3PO, the possibility of navigating an asteroid field is approximately 3,270 to 1. He got away with a lot of stuff, C-3PO. In fact, the recent NASA probe actually indicates that there's a 1,000,000 to 1 chance of getting hit by space junk or an asteroid field while travelling through such a space environment. So, C-3PO, you're wrong. Mythbuster. You can hold your breath forever. Again, we've seen this in the Phantom Menace, Titanic and Gravity. Questionable factor, that one, because the world record currently stands at 22 minutes, would you believe, for someone holding their breath. He's going to hit the laser with his sword. Now there's an error. Alien computers that run Windows. Now I am sure that Windows would be very pleased with that sort of press. But, you know, I doubt very much whether logically that would be the case. If you're moving in space, you'll not stop if your engines get blown up. Sorry, Star Trek 5. That is not quite correct. The baddie in James Bond's film Die Another Day has gene therapy to replace his DNA and therefore change his appearance. Not quite how it works. And often we see the cowboy or you know, in Terminator getting shot by a 9mm bullet. Weighs less than 12 grams. If it's travelling at the particular speed bullets fly, which is roughly 400 metres a second, it's going to knock an 80-kilo man backwards at around about 3 centimetres per second. So it's going to be barely discernible until he hits the point where gravity starts to speed up the fall. So we can see that children's movies and their inaccuracies, apart from talking goldfish and things, we can see that, you know, the scope, the imagination is ripe to challenge. Misconceptions are not necessarily a bad thing, but scientific inquiry is a good thing. And that's what we're on about. A little example here. Here is teaching science using fact or inquiry. Fact is the model that pre-existed and predated inquiry teaching and the ACS. Believe it or not, about 40% of schools across Australia are still swinging over into inquiry-based learning. Because it existed in the ACS, because it's now 5 years old, it doesn't mean it's been universally adopted. We're starting to see more and more of this kind of approach. It's hands-on, but it's not inquiry-based. They have very little opportunity to direct the inquiry. Similarly, students are not able to discuss their findings and develop their understandings of what they have learned. It's very much teaching science as fact. Whereas on the other hand, investigating pond life here, as you see, you go through it, does anything live in the school pond? And look at the processes here. Sort into groups. Brainstorm. Set up a compound and light microscope. Use the microscopes to look at pond water, identify living things. Record your observations. Pay particular attention to group these objects, classify them, and finally come up with some sort of framework or rule or process. Now note, this is more inquiry-based. It's placed in the local context. It's more relevant to students in their world. The focus for the activity is a question for students to investigate. It allows them to prepare their own slides, gives them ownership over data collection. They are scientists in their own world. It concludes with a discussion, helps students to develop their ideas related to the initial questions, and it's an opportunity for students to practice their communication skills. Please pay careful attention here. We are talking about pedagogical approaches, the inquiry model, and it is central. It underpins Assessment Tasks 1 and Assessment Task 2, and hopefully will generate a lot of discussion in our collaborative learning course this term. Thank you very much.